Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. One of the big wins during this legislative session was an environmental one. The Coal Act, also known as the Clean Oregon Assets Legislation, is a new law that directs the Oregon State Treasury to end investments in coal. This legislation was spearheaded by Representative Con Pham, a Democrat who represents Southeast Portland. It took 3 attempts to pass and had the support of over 100 organizations and teachers' unions. And so today I have Representative Pham, and we're going to be talking about the divestment from coal and from fossil fuels in general and how this supports our state's climate goals. And we're also going to touch a little bit on how individual investors can divest from fossil fuels if that's something that's important to them. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Representative Pham. Yeah. So to start off, can you tell us a little bit about what divestment means? It's kind of a financial term that some people may not be familiar with.
Sure. Well, divestment is the intentional act of moving one's money or investments out of a certain industry, in this case, the coal industry. So this can be done for a number of reasons, whether because that industry is underperforming or it just does not align with your ethical and moral values. And in this case, for coal investments in Oregon, it poses both a financial risk and a climate danger.
Got it. And we're going to unpack both of those issues. So in terms of the climate one, tell us why this legislation is important. Why is this a big win for environmental groups and for legislators who care about these issues?
Sure. Well, so first a little bit about the legislation. The Coal Act, or HB 4083, would direct the Oregon State Treasury to phase out investments in all publicly traded thermal coal companies, stop any new investments in coal, and require an annual report about how that phase out is going at the end of each year. In 2016, Oregon passed a coal to clean law, which required Oregon to phase out coal from its energy supply out of the recognition that coal is incredibly harmful to human health, and it's one of the dirtiest fossil fuels that are driving environmental pollution and driving climate change and the life-threatening climate disasters that we're seeing today. So this legislation would really align with our existing climate policy and goals.
Mm-hmm. So draw the connection for me here between, we're as a state trying to reduce our use of fossil fuels. We're trying to reduce our emissions. Our investor-owned utilities have a mandate to clean up their energy supply. They have to move away from coal and from natural gas. But you're talking about investments in stocks, bonds, investments in companies, financial investments. What is the connection between financial investments in fossil fuels, in this case coal, and our desires to eliminate dirty energy and eliminate emissions from coal, among others?
Yeah, well, I think that there's 2 ways as a legislator that we invest. We invest through policy and we invest through our money. Many people say budgets are moral documents. Investments are also moral documents. And so we want to make sure that as Oregon is passing climate policy and climate laws that are recognizing that if we want to have a livable planet, we need to move our energy mix out of dirty fossil fuels and into cleaner, renewable energy like solar and wind. Financial investments play an important role in directing the market towards more pro-social outcomes. I think Oregon voters have been clear that they want to see investments in more community solar farms, more wind farms that can really bring the investments to local communities, clean up our air, and really move our money towards the world and the economy that we're trying to build.
And to be clear, I mean, these investments that we currently have that support the coal industry, this is not necessarily the coal industry in Oregon or even in the Pacific Northwest. It's the coal industry in general, right?
Right. Yes. It is about, it can be global coal investments. We want to make sure that we're not helping to build coal-fired power plants in China, because when we shut down our own coal-fired power plants, it was out of the recognition that it was having terrible, harmful impacts to the surrounding community. And so if it's not good for Oregonians, it's also not good for communities elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, we're trying to reduce emissions in Oregon and in our region, but it's all connected. Climate change obviously is a global phenomenon, so that makes sense. So Oregon is not the only place to focus on fossil fuel divestment and coal divestment. This is a global trend, really an international movement. Can you talk a little bit about how this movement to divest from fossil fuels began, whether it's been successful, and what are the current campaigns?
Sure. Well, divestment, when I was growing up, the big movement around divestment was around divesting from South Africa because of the harms that were, the terrible harms that were wreaked on the Black community in South Africa through the system of racial apartheid. Today, the movement is more around fossil fuels, and I think that started with colleges and university endowments, but has now moved into New York City's pension fund, for example, and some state pension funds like Maine's pension funds, their PERS system. So Stand.Earth, actually, one of the leading groups that is tracking this, says that the number of institutions that are divesting from fossil fuels has meant that now we have a combined $1.4 trillion in assets that have been withdrawn. And the legislation that we passed just in this last session in Oregon was really modeled after a legislation that California passed in 2015, SB 185, that divested their largest public pension funds, their CalPERS and their California State Teachers Retirement System, CalSTRS, from coal, and that's. They were able to find in the first 6 years of coal divestment that they had a positive impact of $598 million in returns over what the returns would have been if the funds had been invested in coal.
Interesting. So it sounds like from what you're saying is that this campaign or multiple campaigns have actually been pretty successful and pretty wide reaching, not just colleges, but actually pension funds, even state ones have gone this route. I guess one thing I'm wondering is, has there been a lot of pushback both in Oregon and elsewhere against divestment from fossil fuels and from coal? I mean, when you're talking about it, it kind of seems a no-brainer because, we don't want to keep funding fossil fuels because they're harmful to the planet. But I know it's a lot more complicated. These are financial instruments. So what has the pushback been like? What are the challenges of divestment?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, that increasingly asset managers are recognizing the financial risks of coal and other fossil fuels and starting to move their money out of those investments for financial reasons. I think some of the concerns that these financial managers have is that they want to maintain their fiduciary duty. So we worked closely with the Oregon State Treasurer to ensure that he does, or he or she, whoever ends up being the state treasurer, will retain their fiduciary duty to look out for the returns. They maintain flexibility in that return, but they have a clear directive that all things being equal, they should move our investments out of coal. And increasingly, we're seeing that this is a move that is actually beneficial for our financial returns and our financial security. As we've seen, Oregon has completely moved out of the coal system, and in 2023, at the UN climate talks, the United States committed to completely phasing out coal power plants, joining 56 other nations. So we're seeing a real shift and transition within governance and governments and the energy sectors. We're seeing renewable energy leapfrogging over coal energy. And that's a direction that financial managers are following. They don't want to be left holding the bag with these stranded assets. And so I think it's also these asset managers seeing that coal energy is becoming increasingly expensive and solar and wind energy is now cheaper. cleaner and growing so much faster that it's actually more expensive now for 99% of the coal-fired power plants in the United States to keep on running than it is to build an entirely new solar or wind operation nearby. So just to even maintain coal is more expensive than to build new solar and wind at this moment. So those are the facts on the ground that asset managers are seeing, and it just makes financial and business sense for them.
So those are the risks that you were talking about, that increasingly it's becoming clear that coal infrastructure is a lot more expensive to maintain. Also, fossil fuel prices are pretty volatile based on my research. So it sounds like that, financial managers are kind of seeing into the future that these investments in fossil fuels are going to become more risky.
Exactly. Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has said that the coal industry could face significant stranded asset risk by 2030. That is just 6 years away. And for your listeners who may not be familiar with the term stranded assets, those are hard infrastructure investments that stop being profitable and become a liability before the end of their anticipated economic lifetime. So people are making investments expecting coal-fired power plants to pay back after 60 years or whatever the timeline is. And increasingly, if all these nations and jurisdictions are moving off of coal, then there's a severe risk that they could be holding what they call a stranded asset.
The other thing that you mentioned is that financial managers and pension funds have a duty to their customers, essentially, to protect these pensions. And as I understand, one of the fears is that these are retirement accounts, essentially. These are retirement funds for millions of people. And so there has been some pushback from, even just retirees and people who are afraid, like, how is this going to impact my future payments? Is that a real fear? And it, even if it's not based on reality fully, because as you mentioned, the risks of fossil fuels are becoming bigger and bigger. But is this a challenge when trying to push forward with divestment from these various funds?
Yeah, I think there's I think that people might be under some questions around that are we doing this purely out of a climate reason? And that's definitely a motivation. But I think what's allowed this bill and this legislation to be so successful is that we have been able to join with, financial investors who worked with JP Morgan and some of the largest investors who are just purely looking at this. There's many Republicans who are actually supporting this too, because they look at this as a fiduciary, risk reduction. It's about making sure that in the long run, particularly for people's pensions, we need to be looking at a very long-term horizon, not just trying to get something in the next 6 months, but really, how do we protect Oregon's hundreds of thousands of pension holders to make sure that we are investing in industries that are going to perform well in the long term and reliably in the long term. And so that's something that, retirement funds are not something to gamble away with, kind of short-term investments, but really what at the long term is clear. And it's very clear that coal is a dying industry and not something we want Oregon pension holders to be left holding worthless assets of in the future.
Well, at least it's a dying industry in the United States, maybe. I don't know if in the rest of the world.
Well, like I mentioned, 56 other nations have also declared that they're going to phase out, in addition to the United States. So it is an increasing trend as countries are recognizing that both the human health harms and the catastrophic risk of climate change if we continue to invest in this.
This is still a pretty new thing for many pension funds, though. I mean, we've got a few states that have either passed legislation or attempted to pass legislation, but the vast majority are still not there. Is there any other challenges that are sort of stopping this movement or making it difficult for other pension funds, other states, other cities to adopt this?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that increasingly it's becoming politicized, where we're seeing certain states actually explicitly take the opposite tack and prohibit their state treasurer or their treasury from actually directing investments towards environmental or social goals. And seeing climate change as a partisan issue, when it's clearly not. The laws of physics trump the laws of politics, but I think we are seeing some red Republican states pass laws that prevent any environmental or social governance goal making within the Treasury.
So the Coal Act in Oregon that you just helped pass is focused specifically on divesting from coal, not other fossil fuels. Are there any plans to target other fossil fuels in our investment portfolio? Are there other efforts in Oregon, either among cities or counties, to divest from fossil fuels or from coal?
Well, of course, I see climate policy going in the direction of eventually divesting from other fossil fuels. I think to meet our climate goals, we need to be scaling up our investments in renewable energy infrastructure. Through the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed at the federal level, we are going to see the United States annual renewable energy capacity tripling in the next 10 years. Because of the billions of dollars in investments that the federal government is making to grow our domestic renewable energy sector. So I don't know of any specific laws right now, the legislation that's being contemplated, but I do know that that's the general direction that municipalities and other states will likely be moving in, given the direction of our energy sector.
So we've been talking thus far about large institutions, whether pension funds or funds belonging to organizations divesting from coal or from fossil fuels. But, many regular people in Oregon and elsewhere save for retirement. They either, invest in stocks and bonds, they have a 401k or Roth IRA or some other investment accounts. And, some jobs also contribute to such accounts. And I think many people will be surprised to know that most retirement accounts and employer-sponsored plans actually include a lot of fossil fuel investments, and that our individual investments are really supporting the fossil fuel industry. And so I'm wondering, for somebody who's really interested in helping our planet and in divesting from fossil fuels, what can people do as individuals? Is there anything they can do to get their own dollars, their personal investment, away from supporting the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I think I would say to somebody who is considering divesting their own personal investments to start by calling your financial advisor and telling them, this is the direction I want to go in. I want to divest from fossil fuels. And there are definitely funds that are available that exclude fossil fuels and tobacco and weapons, and other industries that are clearly harmful or antisocial in different ways. And so I think that's a first way to start. And I will mention that I'm very interested in how we can invest in our local businesses. For the last couple of years, I've supported initiatives to start a state or municipal bank in Oregon. North Dakota has a great state bank that allows it to provide financing to support small businesses and community-based businesses. So I think a state bank, we need to be looking at other ways to keep investing Oregonians' dollars in Oregon and supporting our jobs, local jobs, and local businesses here.
That's interesting that you mentioned this. Obviously, the opposite of divestment is investment. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what else we can invest in as a state and as a city. You are one of the founders of Portland's Clean Energy Fund, which was created through a ballot measure in 2018, mainly to support low-income Portlanders in the clean energy transition. Can you talk about this investment that we are making as taxpayers and why this kind of investment is important?
Well, the Portland Clean Energy Fund, as you mentioned, is a ballot measure, and it passed by a nearly 2-to-1 basis by Portland voters to raise money for urgent climate justice investments. And it does that through a 1% business license surcharge on retail corporations that make over $1 billion a year. That's billion with a B. So these are, the wealthiest corporate retail corporations in the world, like Walmart and Comcast, and then we take those funds into what is called the Portland Clean Energy Fund and directs it to projects that help communities, particularly communities that are most impacted by climate change, like low-income communities, communities of color, to be able to weatherize their homes or to be able to get job training in green workforce, in green jobs, to be able to build urban gardens, and really all the things that are going to help us reduce emissions and hopefully increase our resilience to climate disasters, since like being able to access heat pumps and air conditioning during heat wave events or wildfire smoke events, things like that. So I think that's such a critical other side to divestment is what are we investing as we're pulling our money and moving our money away from the bad stuff that we don't like and that we can't keep doing. We need to be reinvesting it in the good stuff like green jobs, solar energy, energy efficiency upgrades for homes and buildings. So Portland Clean Energy Fund is such a great model for that investment in the good stuff, and a recognition that certain communities that have been left out of the dominant economy also need to be part of this transition so they get the benefits. Even if they don't have the upfront capital to build solar panels, how do we ensure that they get some of the energy savings and utility bill savings that come from being able to access parts of solar panels, shares of solar panels, so they can reduce their energy bill. So I am very excited about that. The PCEF has been funding incredible home energy upgrades for low-income African-American homeowners. They and other groups have been installing heat pumps all over the city to low-income residents to make sure that as we're entering this El Nino summer, where we expect some of the hottest summers around the world, but also in Oregon, we're not, hopefully, fingers crossed, we're not going to face some of the same deaths that we faced last time when we were so unprepared with so many people who lack access to air conditioning. I want to make sure that we're equipping our communities to be able to weather those storms and use much less energy in the process.
And I should add that this is a Portland-specific program. However, Oregon has the Climate Protection Program, which was just suspended by the courts, but the state is now relaunching the process to reinstitute this program. And the Climate Protection Program includes a kind of a similar fund or mechanism to fund community climate programs, which polluters such as natural gas, oil companies that are in our state would pay into and could potentially fund programs similar to what the Portland Clean Energy Fund is doing in the city. But the Climate Protection Program and its Community Climate Investment Program could fund such programs statewide. So that's another thing to keep an eye on in the future once the program relaunches.
Yes, I am definitely watching it. I was disappointed to see that the state had to restart their rulemaking due to the lawsuits by these polluters who are going to have to pay into this fund. It's not surprising that both these initiatives, both the Climate Protection Program and the Portland Clean Energy Fund, are facing opposition from these wealthy business interests and polluters who don't want to pay. And we need to keep our eye on that and respect the will of the voters in the case of the Portland Clean Energy Fund and actually, in the state of Oregon, I think people have been very clear that they want to see investments in renewable energy and community-led benefits that come with that transition. So I am excited to see that we, even if our companies and even our politicians may be loath to make corporations pay their fair share, it's really clear that everyday Oregonians know that this is the direction that we need to go in this time of climate emergency.
And that this money is going to be directly invested in our communities.
Exactly.
So you've worked on a lot of environmental and environmental justice legislation. Can you talk about any other legislation that you are looking to pass during the next legislative session, just so people can have an idea of, what else is on the table in the near future?
Well, in 2025, I'm really focused on our transportation sector. Many people don't realize, but transportation is actually the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions of all the different sectors, whether it's commercial or residential. It's how we get around. And in 2025, the legislature is gearing up to develop a major transportation package to fund our transportation system. We're facing incredible challenges. We have a 70% increase in traffic fatalities, and in my district, we're seeing those impacts. I have some of the highest traffic corridors in my district, including 205, 82nd Avenue, Powell Boulevard, and Division. And we need to make sure that we're making investments to keep our streets safe. And we're also seeing major maintenance shortfalls, and it's showing up in more potholes. We have 700 bridges across the state that need to be retrofitted so that we can seismically retrofitted so they can withstand a future earthquake. And we've also got a climate, as I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure that our investments are shifting towards a climate-friendly future. So many people don't have a car in Oregon. 1 in 4 Oregonians can't drive or don't drive. And we need to make sure that for those folks who can't afford to, for whatever reason, they have other options, whether that's public transit or walking or biking. Those are some of the challenges that lie ahead for 2025. That's one of my main focuses. And I'm focused both for the community benefits that it offers as well as the climate goals that our state has articulated.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Representative Pham. This has been a really important conversation, and we're going to be following these topics closely in future stories in the Oregonian and online at Oregon Live. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.